It's really great to be here. Thanks so much for coming. As Harald said, this is a little bit of a different venue, so I apologize for dragging my colleagues down here. But I'm very glad to have perhaps some people from outside of academia coming here. I also want to thank Kunsthalle for making this happen. I think it was a really terrific initiative. I was quite excited when I was given this opportunity, under this umbrella of 100 ways of thinking. And as you can see from my title, I'll be talking about culture and conflict. And I thought it was a really challenging approach because I have 45 minutes and I'm going to present 100 ways of thinking about culture and conflict. That gives me 27 seconds per way of thinking. So I've really been practicing for this speech. So are you guys ready? All right, joking aside. So I'll be talking about perhaps not super uplifting topics that I've been working on and fellow economists have been working on. Such as the Rwandan genocide. I'm going to share, I guess, one way of thinking about these issues. This is sort of how I currently tend to think about these things. I have some good co-authors that tend to share my views and my approach. So I'll be talking about that today. Let me just say from the get-go that I think economists have been a little bit late to the party in studying culture. But it's a very active research space right now, so it's very exciting to be a part of that space. I think there are still many open questions. So today, perhaps I'll share some evidence that we have, but I think it also points to that there's so much stuff that we don't know. And so I think the future is very exciting from that perspective. So as I mentioned, or as Harald mentioned, I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment here. So you all should have like one of these clickers, and if you don't, raise your hand. This is for the purpose, I'll be asking you some questions throughout the lecture, and it's very simple. You will have multiple choice, so it's going to be a number from 1 to 10, and I want you to answer how you feel on this particular issue. So you see a 1, 2, and 3, and so on and so forth. Number 10 option is the same as 0, just so you know. So if you want to press option 10, it's going to be the very bottom one. If you change your mind, so I'm going to allow you to 15, 20 seconds for you to pick your choice. This is going to record whatever you picked last. So if you change your mind, you can do that as long as the poll is open. Okay, so I want to get into this, but let me just sort of a little bit set up some parameters for talking about culture and conflict, which are pretty big topics. So what I'm primarily thinking of here when it comes to conflict, I'm primarily thinking of violence and violent behavior. So this could be pretty broad still, but I want you to think about intrastate violence, civil violence, ethnic violence, ethnic conflicts, these kinds of things. But it can also be, these ideas can also be applicable to, say, intra-household conflict that can explain potentially like domestic violence. So that's sort of on the conflict side. On the culture side, primarily what I'm thinking of here is sort of the set of values and beliefs that individuals in a given society holds. So when I'm talking about culture, I'm not necessarily talking about behavior. I'm talking about the values and beliefs people hold. Behavior is ultimately what we want to understand, not least from a policymaking perspective. And I'll talk a little bit about some policy implications of some of these ideas today. All right, so I want to jump right into this by actually starting to use these clickers. So I'm going to ask you a question that's been asked to many thousands of people around the world on a sensitive topic, which is going to be about domestic violence. And I'm going to ask you this question, the same thing, exact same way it's been asked in the surveys. And I want you to just look inward and think about your own sort of moral position on this particular issue, how you truly feel about it intrinsically, privately. Okay? And then I'm going to ask another question, but that's where I want us to start. So the question is the following. Please tell me for each of the following actions whether you think it can be always justified, never justified, or something in between for a man to beat his wife. So if you feel that it's never justified, you will press 1. If you feel that it can always be justified, you press 10, which is going to be the same as 0. Or if you feel something in between, you press some number in between. Okay? So I want you to, I'll open the poll now, and you can push however you want. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay. All right, now I'm going to ask you a second question. And then now I want you to look outward. Look at the audience in this room. Think about the audience in this room. If you had to guess, what % of the audience do you think answered never justified in this room? So think about it, and now I'll open the poll. So again, if you think from 0 to 10%, you will press a 1. If you think 91 to 100%, you will press 10, which is the same as 0 at the bottom. Or if you think something in between, you press something in between. So I'll open the poll now. All right. Closing in 3, 2, 1. All right, so why am I asking you these questions? So as I mentioned, the first question has been asked to thousands of people around the world, and this type of data has been used to try to explain behavior, violent behavior, when it comes to domestic violence across societies. The second type of question, so the first type of question, I want to elicit your morals, your intrinsic values, okay? Second type of question asks about your perceptions, right? What do people in your social setting, what do they think? What do they value? And I think economics and social sciences more broadly would be very good at measuring the first type of thing, but not the second thing. And I think we're potentially missing a big important part of the story if we want to understand violence. And this could also have policy implications, which I will come back to. Let me also just show you some data from, if you look at the data from around the world. So there's tremendous, when you're asking this question, like I just asked you, the first question, you see tremendous amount of variation across different countries. So a country like Sweden, like my country, you see numbers, something around 90% think it can never be justified, okay? But then you see some other countries sort of at the other side of the spectrum. You have a country like Rwanda, where only 5% say that it can never be justified. In some countries, they have even gone a little bit deeper in particular service and asked particular conditions. So for example, if your wife is cheating on you, can it be justified? Okay? And then in a country like India, you see numbers like 25 to 30% says it can be justified. Another question, another condition is if the wife has not cooked the meal properly, can this be justified? Around 20% think that it can be justified in India. Okay? Now, so these kinds of values, of course, can matter for behavior. This is sort of one key idea. Let me switch gears a little bit and talk more about what I have actually done more research on, which is civil violence, so a bit broader. A similar question has been asked where it's not domestic violence, but violence against other people. And then here again, you see a tremendous amount of variation. So in some countries, it's up to 80, 90%, and some other countries, it's something like 30 and 40%. Again, these kinds of first-order beliefs or private values have been elicited, but not perceptions. And I think that's potentially missing a part of the story. Why? Okay, so think about now for a second. Think about an individual here in the middle that holds a particular value. Okay, you can think, if you want to think about the previous question, maybe this person, maybe here red means that he thinks that sometimes violence against other people can be justified. And he lives in a society around him where there's a small minority that thinks the way he thinks about it. Now consider that the social environment changes. Think about the same person, but the social setting is changing. So maybe there's slightly more people that think like this person thinks. Different social setting, a different social setting, a different social setting. So here's a social setting where it's the same person, but the vast majority agrees that it can be justified, violence against other people. I think the question here is, we have good reasons to believe, or the sort of idea is that we have good reasons to believe that behavior can be different in these two types of different social settings for the same kind of individual. Why? Well, let me ask you. Why would the person in the middle potentially behave differently and be more inclined to perform violent acts? Yes?
Because he thinks it's tolerated.
Right. That's the very simple basic idea. So this person on the left lives in a social setting where it's basically not socially acceptable to be violent. Okay? So he might be socially ostracized and punished in different ways socially if he performs this act. Okay? The person on the right, on the other hand, live in a totally different social setting where it can be more morally justified by other people, and the social cost may therefore be lower. Okay? So when we're thinking about two different societies, society to the left with a low level of acceptance and a society to the right, there are really two mechanisms going on at the same time. There's a direct effect of the number of red people, which is that their own private morals. But they live in also in different social settings, so there's different social acceptability regarding this. And this adds another different mechanism. Okay? And the second mechanism, we don't have very good evidence on. But I think there are good reasons conceptually to believe that this could be an important trigger. Okay? This also opens up, I think, questions on what can drive and cause a society from going, say, from the left side to the right side. And a natural starting point is to think about exposure to mass media and ideas and ideals that are being portrayed on mass media. And here I think we actually have some pretty good evidence from different social contexts. So, for example, there are two authors, Rob Jensen and Emily Oster, have studied the impact of cable television in India. And they saw that this could affect gender norms in a progressive way. Actually measuring these questions through these questions that I just posed a little bit earlier. Okay? So mass media can play this particular role, and this has been studied quite well. There's a different setting, if we take a step back, that I want us to also think about, which is the distinction between reality and perception. So you can think that perhaps in a given society, reality looks like to the right, but the perceptions of reality among the people is different. People perceive the society to be to the left. Okay? So here, social norms are misperceived. The values in society are misperceived. And this concept has existed in other social sciences for a long time, in sociology and psychology, and it's basically called pluralistic ignorance. Okay? And I think this is a concept that we don't have good data on, or we don't have good evidence on, but I'll show you some evidence today. Under such circumstances, you may think about a different role for social media. So one role for social media, for mass media, whether that be TV or radio or even online media, is that mass media helps us get from a distorted perception of reality closer to the truth. Okay? This is what you would expect if mass media is unbiased and searching for the truth, reporting about the truth on a constant basis, so that people are closely in line. Reality and perception are closely aligned. But I think there are good reasons to believe that mass media will not always perform this role. Quite the contrary. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that what mass media, strategically set up by political elites, is actually trying to distort reality, okay, and moving away people from reality. Okay? And this is something that I've studied in the context of the Rwandan genocide, which I want to talk about next. Okay? And in particular, I wrote this paper a few years ago on the role of propaganda during the Rwandan genocide. So a quick recap of the Rwandan genocide that happened in 1994. It happened during 100 days. Essentially, 800,000 to 1 million people were slaughtered. There were two ethnic groups, the Hutu majority and the Tutsi minority. The Tutsi minority consisted of between 10 and 15% of the population. Okay? This violence was performed not only by state actors, but what's really striking about this historical episode is that ordinary people participated in the violence, often using very primitive weapons such as clubs or machetes, and killing their neighbors. So it was very localized violence. Okay? So it's a very disturbing episode in human history. To add to this, there was this radio station called RTLM, Radio Mel Colin, that was spewing propaganda leading up to the genocide and during the genocide. Okay? Basically, in short, encouraging the Hutu majority people to partake in the violence, making it morally justifiable to partake, and also spreading information about that a lot of people are partaking in this violence. Okay? And it also used very dehumanizing language to describe the minority group Tutsis. And instead of me describing sort of, I want to show you a brief clip so you can get a sense of the kind of messages that were being broadcast.
Comme aujourd'hui dimanche, dimanche 19 juin 1994 et il est 16h22 à Kigali dans le blindé de la RTLM. Avis à tous les Inyembi qui nous écoutent. Oui, à tous les Inyembi qui nous écoutent. Le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous les Inyembi, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
abatwumva ko nyine abantu bose bahagurukiye kurwanya inyenzi inkotanyi n'ababwiye abasirikare bacu nibo ba mbere mbabwira urubyiruko rwagutse kugira ngo bafashe abasirikare bacu mbabwira inkumi mbabwira abasore murabyumva rero inyenzi ntabwo zishobora gukandira abantu bose
imana tugira iwacu nuko ari bake cyane
ni bake cyane ndetse nubwo twabariraga ku ijana ku 10%, ubwo basigara 8%. abo bantu se koko
muze twishime nshuti inkotanyi zashize muze twishime nshuti yewe imana ntirenganya koko kuvuga hano niturwana tugatsinda inyenzi inkotanyi burundu bazodutsinda urubanza n'ububaho kuko ruzaba turarwanya kandi batsinda nidutsindwa byo birumvikana iyo twarigishyira mu gihugu.
All right. So, quite disturbing broadcast, as you can see. And there's an element here of moral appeals, that this is something that's not only acceptable, this act, but perhaps even an obligation to perform. Notice also there's a component of social context. They were repeatedly informing people that lots of other people have joined in on these massacres, and you should as well. Okay? So my basic question in this research paper was, can these kinds of propaganda that affects people's perception of the world and the reality actually translate into more violent behavior? And so what I did was I collected data on where the transmitters were. There were two main transmitters that were put on the highest mountains on the highest mountain in Rwanda, which is top left corner, and then in the middle of Kigali, the capital. And here you see, I was able to calculate where this radio station could be listened to, and you see darker blue means higher radio coverage. Rwanda is called the land of 1,000 hills. It's not unsimilar to Switzerland in that you have hills and valleys everywhere. And from a methodological standpoint, this is advantageous because it basically creates a lot of random variation in who could listen to the radio and who could not. So therefore, from a methodological standpoint, you can get close to a causal effect. Then I also had data on violence, and so across different villages in Rwanda. And to cut to the chase, what I find is that I concluded that this radio station had a significant impact on total violence in the country. You see a vertical bar, which was the actual violence, and then I try to calculate the counterfactual violence, the amount of violence that would have been in the country in the absence of these broadcasts. And I see something like between 50 to 80,000 fewer perpetrators that would have not partaken had the radio not been broadcasting. Okay? Second of all, if you look at the shape of these effects on the x-axis, you see the share of the village with radio reception and the effect on violence. There's this interesting pattern where if up to 60% of the village can listen to the radio station, there seems to be no effect. But then there seems to be something that looks like a nonlinear or a threshold effect. Once you reach 70, 80% of the population that are being exposed, violence starts to kick in. Okay? And this is consistent with the model of what economists call strategic complementarities, where I'm more willing to partake in the violence if other people share my beliefs and also take part and take the same actions as I am. Okay? All right. So I've often been asked, so what are the policy implications of this kind of work? And it's not easy to give a straightforward answer. But I think it's illuminating to look at the policy debate of this radio station around the time of the genocide. The UN Peacekeeping General Dallaire informed the UN Security Council about what was going on, demanding or encouraging the international community to shut down this radio station, either bombing these transmitters or jamming this radio station. The US State Department made some calculations how costly this would be, and this could be done with a few $1,000s pretty cheaply. In the end, they decided not to for various geopolitical reasons. I noticed if you notice one thing though in this debate is people were saying, look, there's no evidence this would actually persuade anyone to commit violent acts. And in fact, to be fair, there was no hard evidence before this paper that media can have these effects on violence. Second of all, some people appeal to free speech, okay? So where's the boundary where we should stop allowing free speech, okay? Which is a very challenging question, okay? I think this paper shows you that there's a potential trade-off here, so that there's an argument for limiting free speech. I think there's another potential policy implication of this, which is sort of think of the symmetrical case. Well, if media can induce violence, one question is, can media induce peace from a violent situation? And there isn't a lot of evidence of this, but there's one paper by some other authors, Armand, Atwell, and Gomez, pretty recent paper that looks at when the UN was setting up a radio station in Central Africa to encourage rebels to defect and come back to their hometowns. And they're basically spreading these messages that, look, you will be accepted when you will come back. We will not harm you when you will come back, and so on and so forth. They estimate that this had a very significant impact on defection rates and violence in Central Africa. Okay? And you actually see a similar nonlinear pattern here, which is interesting in terms of the scale effects. Okay? All right, I want to switch gears a little bit and look at perhaps a close cousin to sort of political violence, which is a more peaceful way of engaging in politics, which is political protest and say marches or rallies. And so we've seen throughout history many different forms of protest for hundreds of years in different contexts. I mean, more recently, anti-Trump protest, social conservatives protesting in the streets, fiscal conservatives, the Tea Party in the US was a big movement. Even historically, you've seen Nazis marching in the streets of different German towns in the early 30s. Okay, so something that I'm working on right now, I've been working on and still working on with some colleagues here at the university, is thinking about the role of protest and marches. And here I think we need to switch a little bit sort of the conceptual framework and expand it a little bit. So I want you to now think about, still there are people that have different values in society. So think of the red versus the gray. March is basically what it does, and you can think of literally like a march on a road like this with people with the same values, showing what they believe in. And then there's going to be some bystanders that are exposed to this and observe these actions. Okay? One question, therefore, is this also persuasive in the same way that mass media can be persuasive? Well, what would that mean? That would mean that some of these people that are exposed would now change their views and values. Okay? Now, the thing with protest, I think, that for a protest to really change society and have big impact, it cannot really be that just people that are bystanders are affected. There must be some more indirect effects as well for this to really matter. Of course, with modern mass media, things are a little bit more complicated because mass media you can be exposed to it's not like 100 years ago where you had to actually literally show up at the streets to see these protests. But conceptually, it's not perhaps that different. So what about the rest of society? Okay, so here I think one way to go, and there's very little evidence on this, is we need to perhaps start thinking about how people are connected in society through social networks. Who talks to who is sharing political ideas, values with each other, okay? So whether this be colleagues at work that you talk to, or perhaps friends that you talk about with, regarding politics. But if we know sort of the social network structure, you can think of the top left person that's persuaded. He might persuade his friend or his colleague, and this can continue, and potentially there's diffusion throughout society based on these networks. And then you end up in a situation like this where a lot of people that weren't directly exposed to these marchers change their minds, okay? So I think there's still very much an open question, do they matter? Can you move to a situation like on the left to a situation on the right, where people are persuaded by people just showing up in the streets, proclaiming what they believe in? There's a good reason to believe that the null hypothesis is the right one, which is, look, all this is a display of your beliefs, but it's not really persuading anyone. If Nazis are marching on the street, nobody will turn into a Nazi just because of this. We know they are Nazis, I don't like Nazis, and so I won't become a Nazi, right? So you wouldn't see this effect. But still, it's an empirical question, right? I worked on looking at, together with colleagues at Harvard, Danny Schowags, Dan Vorger, and Andreas Marestam at Stockholm University. We wrote what I think is the first paper that established that political protests can actually change people's political views. We looked at a major protest that happened in 2009. The Tea Party protested in several hundred locations in the US, and we have data on how many people that showed up. And what we're using is whether there happened to rain on this day, randomly take two places that are for which there's equally likelihood of rain. The places for which it rained, we showed that, look, a lot of people showed up to these protests. So this created a sort of natural experiment, and we can therefore detect the persuasive effect of these protests. And we find that basically for every additional protester, you get something like 4 additional Republican votes in the next election. So this was persuasive. This is probably a lower bound. This is giving you the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval. Actually, the main effects may have been even larger than that, up to 10 people. All right, so this establishes that actually political protest can influence people's views and behavior. I'm currently working on a project with Professor Joachim Voss here at the university and postdoc Bruno Capretini on trying to understand the impact of the Nazis marching through the streets of Hamburg in April 1932. This happened between 2 elections. There was one election in March, and there was another election in July. And we look at, during 2 different days, the Nazis were marching through the streets of Hamburg, and we have dug through the different police records to figure out exactly what streets they were marching on. And we have pretty good data on how people voted in the election at the very local neighborhood level. And so we have some very preliminary evidence indicating that there's something like a direct effect of exposure if we sort of just look at people living very close to these marching paths, and we have an identification strategy to make us believe that this is causal. We're still in the process of, as I mentioned, figuring out these indirect effects. And here the idea is to look at occupational networks and neighbors. And we basically have the universe of where people lived and what occupations they were having. And so we are now in the process of constructing all these networks to see if there was this diffusion effect that we are anticipating. So that's still a work in progress, and this is an interesting project that I hopefully will shed more light on the role of political protest. Let me go back to something that I mentioned very early on, which is this distinction between what people believe is reality and what is the actual reality, okay? And this concept of pluralistic ignorance. All right, so if we are in this kind of context, if we're in this context, the policy implications may be very different, okay? And I have a project on that, but I want to get you guys to get into this again. So I'm going to ask you a second question. This time is going to be on gender norms again, but in a slightly different context, more in a labor market context, which is closer to the actual project that I ran, okay? So read this through, and I will open the poll. So I want you to figure out or answer whether you agree with the following statement: both husband and wife should contribute to household income. Oh, it's not open? Sorry. Oh, it's open. Okay. So please vote now. Okay, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, now I'm going to ask you the second type of question, which is about your perception. Whoops. If you had to guess, what % of people in the room answered strongly agree? Okay. Closing the poll, 3, 2, 1. All right, so notice again, I asked you first about your private value, your private view, your moral conviction, and then I asked you about perception about this social context and the moral convictions of other people in the room. Traditional economics, I would say, if you just look at sort of models on this, would assume that we're all perfectly informed about other values in society. Okay? So each one of you knew perfectly how other people in this room were thinking. Okay? My proposition, which I think is not a very strong one, is that this is a very hard object to really know, okay? I obviously have no idea in this particular context how right you are, okay? So this is guesswork for me. Maybe there's pluralistic ignorance, maybe there's not. Let's take a look. All right. So already here you can see that you guys have vastly different views on the social norms in this limited group. And notice here we're talking about actually a lot of you are colleagues with each other here and students of the department. So it's not a very heterogeneous group. It's not like I flew people from East China and you had to guess what their values are, right? All right. So the most common one here is number 4, which is 31 to 40%. Let's see what what the actual answer was. Well, this would have been fantastic if it worked. So I don't know why this is not working now. This is so typical. All right. So I'm going to ask you again. Okay. And of course, you should answer what you answered the first time. Had this been my research project, it would have been a failure, right? So please vote again. The technology doesn't want to play today. Sometimes it takes a few seconds, but okay. All right. I was not able to. Have you experienced the same, Lorenzo? Yeah. All right. Well, at least there's strong disagreement in the room on what the values are, right? And there is a truth out there. I was just not able to convey to you what the truth is. So now I really want to know because there's so much heterogeneity, right? Okay, so if you look around countries where this question has been asked, here's the distribution of the number of people that strongly agree across different countries. I also give you 4 vertical bars. These are vertical bars for 4 different countries. One is Sweden, another one is New Zealand, Japan, and Saudi Arabia, okay? So would anybody dare to guess where, for example, Sweden is here? Where you think Sweden would be? Is Sweden way to the left or way to the right? Or so you think it's, yeah. So let's see where Sweden is. All right, here's Sweden. All right, let's see. Here's New Zealand. Here's Japan. Here's Saudi Arabia. I don't know what your prior was. Maybe I should have asked you that as well. But Saudi Arabia is pretty much in the middle of the pack when it comes to this value, this gender norm. This was surprising to me. Of course, the real question is not whether this is surprising to me. The real question is whether this is surprising to people in Saudi Arabia, right? Do people in Saudi Arabia know what people in Saudi Arabia think about gender? Okay, that's the question. There could be a pluralistic ignorance equilibrium. So this is a project that I've worked on with co-authors from Chicago University, Lear Burstein and Alessandra Gonzalez. We asked a very simple question, which is, in my opinion, women should be allowed to work outside of the home. This is also a survey question that's been asked in many, many different countries, and people had the options to answer yes or no. We brought people from different neighborhoods around Riyadh, the capital. So a lot of these people also know each other, just like in this room. Groups of 30 we would have in. We had a total of 500 people, and they basically went through the same kind of exercise that we have here. Turns out that 87% answered yes to this. They did this online survey anonymously, by the way. And I'm not going to get into all the methodological details. But we detect strong misperceptions and a pluralistic ignorance equilibrium. So the vertical bar here in the middle is how much, the x-axis measures how people were off from reality. So if everybody knew perfectly, which is what the standard model would assume, everyone would be at 0, okay? Very few people are at 0, and the vast majority are to the left. What does that mean? It means that men in Saudi Arabia, although 87% of them are progressive, at least from the way we're measuring, think that other men, many of them which they know, are much more conservative than they are. Okay? Then we ran an experiment. We said, what if we inform these men about what their peers think, their values? I should mention something important here in terms of culture context. We were interested in studying female labor supply. Why do we look at men? Turns out that men have a lot of decision-making power in Saudi Arabia. There's this phenomenon or this institution called guardians, where if a woman is going to apply for a job and accept a job, she has to bring written approval to show the employer that her guardian approves of this. So we thought a key constraint might be the men in this situation. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that women want to work in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, women are more educated on average than men. So the college education rates are higher for women than for men. So we had an experiment where a very simple one, kind of like in this room, we would randomly inform half of the men in the room what the other men in the room answered. And then they had a very simple choice, which is to sign up their wives for a job matching service that would help their wives find a job. This is a well-known firm in Saudi Arabia. On average, we find a pretty significant treatment effect. It goes from 23% chose to sign up when they don't get information about what the peers think. This goes up to 32%, so that's a 9 percentage point impact. So that's about a 40% increase in the likelihood of signing up. Okay? We then tracked these husbands and wives 5 months later and did a follow-up and looked at the actual labor supply. And we find that the likelihood that they applied for a job goes up from about 6% to 16%. So not quite a tripling, but quite a big impact. The likelihood that they interviewed for a job goes up by about 5 times, still from a very low baseline of 1%, so from 1 to 5%. They're more likely to be employed, although this is not statistically significant. So what this showed you was a situation in Saudi Arabia, which a lot of us perceive as very, very conservative, and by objective measures, it is for sure very conservative. But nevertheless, they seem to be in somewhat of a pluralistic ignorance equilibrium, where they think other people in society are much more conservative than what is really the case. In scenarios like this, there are policy implications, which is what Ben Abu and Tirol, two economists, calls norm-based interventions, which is if you deviate from the standard model and start assuming that people may actually don't know what the values are in society, but if the government or some actor have superior information, there's scope for simple policy interventions where you just inform people about the values in society. And this is what our experiment did, and we find real effects on labor supply. Note that this is a very cheap intervention, by the way, compared to the standard measures of increasing labor supply, female labor supply, such as subsidizing childcare and so on and so forth. Okay, so with that, I'm going to conclude, but let me just say that I think the road ahead for these questions, I've given you sort of snippets of evidence that I think points to that these are some ideas that might have sort of empirical bearing. I think there's still a lot of open questions in this space, and I think we'll learn much more in the next few years here, not only in the projects I'm working on, but the profession as a whole. If we run the same 100 ways of thinking, 10 years from now, probably we have learned a lot, and we will think perhaps differently about the world than what I've portrayed today. But I'm excited to be part of the university, and I'm very excited to be part of the Department of Economics, and looking forward to the road ahead. So I would like to thank you so much for listening.